Welcome to the LeaderCast podcast, a weekly deep dive into the stories that transformed our guests into leaders worth following. I'm your host, Joe Boyd. If you've been enjoying the podcast, thank you so much for being a listener. One simple thing you can do to help us out is give a review wherever you listen. Today's guest is Herrmann-Nehdi. She is the Chief Thought Officer and Chair of the Board for Herrmann, which is a worldwide operation that helps us figure out our brains and how to operate with one another. I did this assessment years ago. I sent it to her, and we'll see what she says about me. Herrmann-Nehdi, welcome to the LeaderCast podcast. We are super excited to have you.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here.
I'm especially excited because I'm like a personal kind of assessment junkie anyway. I've done them all. Enneagrams of the world I've camped in most of my life, but the Herrmann brain stuff, which you have been more than a part of, your name shares it. So we'll talk about that in just a second, is one that I discovered 3 or 4 years ago, working with a client that was way into it. So just as a personal aside, I sent you my assessment, I think from 2019, and we will, you can read my tea leaves here in a little bit, if you're cool with that. But before then, I want to go back and just hear your whole story. Could you let us know just a little bit, though, of big picture, if you're in an elevator and someone asks, what do you do? Tell us a little bit about where you are currently in your life and what you do, and then we can kind of go back and dive in.
Absolutely. Sure. Thank you. So yes, I am incredibly lucky to be able to do work that I love tremendously. And I grew up on it because I had a father who wired me up to the EEG for testing after school, which was kind of explains how I turned out, and who was doing brain research. And so, what we have today is an assessment that was originally created by him called the Herrmann Brain Dominance Instrument that helps you understand why it is you look at the world the way you do and how you process information, how you make decisions, how you solve problems. And it does it in a way that is totally non-judgmental and also very practical. So part of my focus has been on how do we really help people understand themselves in a way that they can do something about it as soon as they've learned about how they think, right? So that's what we're all about. And I'm now chair of the board and chief thought leader of Herrmann. So I was a second generation leader, and then I have now my son who's running the company, the day-to-day leadership. So,
well, no pressure, but you're at a brain institute and you're the chief thought leader. Man, that's a lot. That's a lot to go to sleep thinking about.
It's so interesting. Somebody said to me, now that's a cool title the other day. And I said, yeah, but you know what? That whole thought leadership thing, it's actually what when I work with leaders, one of the things I like to say to them is, do you carve out enough think time in your day? And that was something that you could kind of say with a straight face a few years ago. Now people look at you like, are you kidding me?
Yeah,
right. I have, and you have to actually calendar it, right?
Yeah.
So this idea of really blocking think time. So I'm really lucky in that is a big piece of my role, but that ability to continue to do the research, understand what's happening in the field, really dig deeper into how learning is working. And then right now, the world of work is just tremendously changing right before our eyes. And then AI jumping in and ChatGPT. Yeah. So we're in this situation right now at this very moment where taking a moment to stop and think is probably more important than it's ever been. Yeah. But that's kind of part of my job description, so I'm pretty lucky.
Love that. Perfect. And hopefully this even conversation for folks can be a prompt to do that, to stop and think. So I wanted to ask some of my normal questions and get a read on your story. But I am seriously interested in, for using me as a little bit of a case study, because I sent you my stuff, to just kind of see how you process and talk people through real life situations. You can be my therapist at the end of this if you're okay with that. I've had a remarkably sort of challenging week, so it'll be great.
Okay, perfect. Happy to do that.
But before then, you just mentioned your dad hooking you up to brain machines, so that's fun. Let's go back to your childhood and tell me what kind of kid were you? And I always love the question, if it fits for you. Were there any sort of adventure stories or that caught your heart or your mind's attention? I'm just interested in little Ann and what she was doing running around the world early on.
Very interesting question indeed. So I started off being somebody who was a big dreamer, and one of my favorite books, and I read it pretty young, was Jack Kerouac's book On the Road.
Wow.
And as I thought about why that was such an important book for me, it sort of sparked this idea of finding meaning and freedom at the same time, right? And that ability to to kind of go out there and create your own journey, right? It just felt so inspiring. And at school, I was one of those students that was just constantly challenging what was happening, because I was always looking for something new and interesting. So I struggled to kind of stay put in my seat in school, because even though I did it because I had to comply, I was always just kind of wanting to get out there and learn something in a different way, right? So I often ended up in many of those programs that were special programs for kids who wanted to learn something different, try some new teacher approach or whatever, just because I think people picked up on the fact that I was a non-traditional student in many ways. So being that person who sort of dreamt about the ability to create your own journey was really something that started at a super young age for me.
What flashed in my mind, I was put in the gifted program, which is what they called it back in the day.
They still do call it that, believe it or not. Yeah.
In like third grade, and then I didn't get in fourth grade. I was like, what happened? Where'd my gifting go? But I must have lived on the line of giftedness my whole life.
Nothing like being tagged, right? So, how'd that feel to not get in the program the next year? I can imagine that must have been kind of disappointing.
Think how much confidence I would have had if it had just been the opposite.
Right.
No, I hadn't thought of that for years, but I was also kind of a dreamer and introspective kid, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm curious, because you did mention, I know your father basically invented this program that you ended up spending your career leading, really. So how, when you think of a kid and his work, how did that when did you understand what he was doing? How did that work into your everyday life?
Well, it was kind of interesting, because it was a little obtuse back then. Come into the den, let me wire you up, and it was interesting. It was a little weird. We had a weird reputation in the neighborhood, right?
Sure.
And interestingly enough, the guy who ended up being my husband, I had said to my dad, please don't wire him up when he came to meet the family. I kind of like this guy. And of course, I went out shopping and came home, and there he was, all wired up. And so there was this constant experimentation in our world. And I was intrigued by it, but it was also a lot, as a kid, to kind of feel like you were sort of under the microscope a little bit a lot of the time. But he involved us. He invited us at the time. He worked at GE, so he was at Crotonville at the time, the education campus of General Electric. And so we knew a lot about what he was doing. And I think interestingly enough, being the daughter of a physicist who was also doing learning made me very curious about the field, but I needed to kind of get away from it. So I ended up living in France for about 15 years. I did all sorts of other things. I was in sales. I was an interpreter. I was a programmer. So I did a bunch of other things before I came back to this work. And it was once I kind of woke up one day and I was in a management position, and I was struggling with somebody who I was working with. And I went, now I get it. Now I get what that was really all about. I understood it intellectually, but when I was having a challenge really connecting and communicating with somebody I was leading, it started to really make sense, because I realized, like, I have this toolkit that I grew up on, and other people don't necessarily have it. So I got very excited about it at that point, because it was something that for me was sort of I took for granted, to be honest with you, because I knew it, and it was kind of part of my nomenclature. So it was through actually being in that situation that where I needed something to help that I was able to kind of say, and the light bulb went off. And I called my dad up and said, so I was in this situation, and he just chuckled and said, finally. I mean, it's taking you this long to figure out that that's what this is all about. So yeah, so it was interesting, but that's when the aha kind of really struck for me at first.
I'm curious how it was progressing. Just as had your dad, for lack of a better word, had he already sort of productized it? Was it already? Were there assessments? Were there already people getting help with it, or was that sort of what you brought to the story of it?
He had. No, he had. It was something that he created for a workplace need. So here he was in a huge organization, and it was very clear that they knew a lot about the folks who worked at GE, but he was trying to figure out, how do we unlock that special secret sauce that people have when they have to solve a problem. And so he had, kind of gotten the organization to fund the development of this assessment tool. And it was built inside the organization to solve an organizational problem.
Okay. I didn't realize that. So it wasn't intended at first to be outside.
At first to be that at all. And then suddenly it kind of took a life on as its own, because he started speaking about it, getting invited to conferences to talk about his research and all that. And other companies started reaching out and saying, hey, his colleagues at IBM would say, hey, can you come and run a session for me like what you're doing over there? I'm really interested, and so on and so forth. So when he took early retirement, he was able to negotiate a deal with GE, which is interesting. And they basically said, hey, give us 10 years of free consulting and we'll give you the IP that you created. Which worked out. Yeah. And so he had a built-in client, if you know what I mean, and then he had the IP. But he was not an entrepreneur by design, and so it was a whole new. This is in his late 50s, right? So, and so it wasn't really a product at that point. It was something that he had built, but this idea of taking it to market and sort of figuring out what that was all about, it was more a life passion thing than a business thing. Gotcha. As an entrepreneur.
And do you have siblings as well?
I do. I have an older sister and a younger sister.
Were they part of the family business?
They were, they came in, once I ended up coming to join him. I was living in France at the time, and he reached out and sort of invited me on this adventure to come back to the US after 15 years in France. And I was kind of like, And I said, why me? And he said, because I could tell that you get it. Because you reached out to me when you started to put the pieces and parts together. You went to get certified to learn more. And I just feel like this would be a good fit. He was in North Carolina at the time. I never lived in North Carolina. He was in the mountains. I'm thinking Paris, it was a big decision. Sure. But it was, I figured I'd come for a year and try it, see if it worked out. And that was a long time ago, over 35 years ago. So yeah, so it was, it's where it all started. My other two sisters joined at different stints throughout the way, throughout some of those early years, and they have since retired and are doing other things. Gotcha. But it was a family business for a while, for sure.
Well, he was probably just reading your childhood brainwaves and knew you could run it. That's what was happening, right?
I think so. He didn't really want to admit that, but sure. I'm sure that's what he did. He sort of looked at it and said, because he couldn't help himself and do that, right? He did it with the guy who turned out to be my husband. So, why would he not do it with me as he's thinking about bringing me in, right? Yes, I'm sure that's what he did. Okay. And actually, we have very similar profiles. So, not surprised, right?
Could you go ahead and explain just, I'm sure you're used to this, kind of the system and the colors and how it all works?
Sure, absolutely. So if you think about any model, you can and you divide it up into four. So if you had a circle and you divide it up into four quadrants, you would see that all of us have an analytical self that just loves to break things down, solve problems, and it's all about understanding the data, right? And we all have that within us, but maybe you have somebody in your life who loves that more than you do.
Yeah.
Somebody who works with you or works for you. We have a very practical self that's all about getting stuff done, bias for action, details, organization, and planning. And maybe you have somebody on your team who really helps that, or something that kicks in for you. On the right side of the model, and lower right, you have that relational self. And as leaders, that's that part where we're connecting with people. We get joy out of that leadership role. We tend to be more empathic and love to share our thinking with others. And then we have that experimental self. This is where my father was very much. And that's in that upper right quadrant. And so that's all about the big picture and ideas and going after new things. And many, many entrepreneurs will actually have a profile that that looks like that. So analytical, and we often refer to that as the blue quadrant. Practical, it's the green quadrant. Relational is the red quadrant, and experimental, the yellow. And you have a degree of preference across all of those, and that's your profile. And what's great about it is you can think of it as a rubber band. So you're not like stuck in one place for the rest of your life. You can stretch in all areas, and we do all the time. So, you know, if you think about your profile, Joe, you've got a very, very big picture kind of thinking approach to the world. You love new ideas. You get really excited about being able to do things that are different and new. Doesn't mean you can't do the more practical, detail-oriented things, but it probably takes more of your energy to do that, right? So that's just an example, right, of how that looks.
Right. So how mine looks, I'm looking at it, is I'm not off the chart yellow. There's a tiny little slither of yellow left there, but I'm super yellow. 123 is my number score, whatever that means. And then I'm a 68 red, and then in the 40s for blue and green. So how does that compare to yours? I'm curious.
Yes, we actually have very similar profiles. I am very much that big picture thinker. And so I can completely align with you on that. And that's part of the entrepreneur in me that I discovered as I became involved in this business and as a leader that I had expressed in many different ways in previous careers. But once I realized that I could build a company and lead, to take things to a next level, I got extremely excited about it. I also have a strong analytical self. That's through business and through some of the technical background that I had. And then I'm pretty strong in the relational self. My least preferred is that practical, where I make sure I have people working with me who bring that to bear and remind me, hey, Ann, weren't we going to do this? Right. So, but I can go there if I need to. Right. So we have really very similar profiles.
Just a big, broad question, right? Because it's a leadership podcast. So,
yes.
And I'm a story guy. I'm a myth guy. Like, are there almost archetypes or prototypes of each of these leaders? If I'm saying this an awful way, let me know. But if I would say that I'm more of a yellow kind of leader, right? Or red, blue, or green, is there like a common journey that we all got to go through to learn how to be a good leader? Like, I'm sure early on we just assumed people are like us. I did. And I found out a lot of people aren't. So if you take like you and I, so high yellow, going through our leadership journey, it's not always chronological, but let's say it is, like in your 20s and 30s. And what's a typical pathway? What lessons do we need to learn to lead folks different than us,
Actually, I think it's a really great question. So first and foremost, I think it really all starts by looking in the mirror, right? And understanding how you're showing up in that leadership position. And because leadership really requires whole brain thinking. And we look at the data, CEOs tend to have a very high frequency of balanced profiles across all four quadrants. And that's because the work requires it. But when you think about leadership, you've got to be able to get your head around the financials and the business and the numbers, and understanding technology in today's environment has become incredibly important. And so, and as a leader, you need to be able to kind of understand what that language is. Somebody said to me the other day, I speak in spreadsheets. And I said, okay, well, does that work for everybody else in your organization? They said, not really. I can see their eyes glaze over, right? As soon as I start the meeting. And then we also need that green, which is that ability to, and which is that practical self, that ability as a leader to be clear and have processes in place that actually allow you to execute and lead people in a way where they understand what is expected and they can then take action, right? And that clarity is really important. But if you don't have the relational piece, which is for me, as I think about, kind of growing up, wasn't the strongest suit for my dad. And I watched him as he was building his business, and that need to kind of reach out and make connections with all kinds of people, and build relationships both on the client side and internally as a leader. It took a lot of his energy to do that. He could do it, but it took a lot of his energy. And then ultimately the yellow serves not only entrepreneurs, but all leaders in that ability to see the big picture. And I'm finding in today's environment with things moving so fast, if you can't step back and see what's going on, you can get caught off guard in your business and in your leadership role. And suddenly you realize, whoa, I should have been paying attention to that.
Yeah.
And there's something going on over there with a competitor or with something that I needed to be able to see that I wasn't seeing because I was, for example, too focused in the weeds. And, a leader I talked to the other day was saying, my gosh, I brought my head up and I looked around me and I was kind of like, when did this all happen?
Right.
So it's about really being able to stretch into each of those different areas as the situation requires it, but understanding where your grounded base is and then leveraging that to the max. And once you do that, you can bring together people around you who complement you.
Yeah.
And really serve you and your company really well.
Is it fair to say that maybe one of the worst things I think we make people do is decide what they want to do when they grow up when they're 18? And
I couldn't agree more.
I have, my kids right now are 24 and 21 and still just barely starting to just begin to figure that out. And that was my story too. But what I wanted to ask was, is it the sort of thing where like anybody can do almost any job? You just have to be aware of this and adapt? Or do you think there are maybe someone listening to this that might just be kind of miserable in their job? Could it just be that they aren't wired to have that kind of job? Is that part of this?
I would say that, you can, just as you just described a great example, you can be in a job and you could be functional. Yeah. Right. Which means that you can adapt to any given situation. But if you're miserable, exhausted, hating to get up, like, getting out of bed in the morning is just, real drudgery. We have found that certain kinds of work tend to lend themselves to certain thinking patterns really well. And so it's about having that, because this is preference that we're measuring. Yeah. So it's about having that joy, that sense of work that doesn't feel like work because it's so interesting to you. And I have met many people over the course of my career who have said to me after discovering this, now I get why it is that I've suddenly landed myself in a role. I was talking to someone the other day who had been promoted into a management position. He was like this amazing sales guy. And his path to success was management. And he found himself in meetings day in and day out, managing, quotas and all this kind of stuff. And he hated it. He was like, I lost the bit about my job that I loved the most, but it was the only way up for me. Yeah. And we talked about, well, maybe there's some other ways that you can actually find that joy and not find yourself in a management position. So it is one of those things where I think if you're feeling that, think about what are the options within your current role that allow you to find the pieces of your current role that you love, that get you excited. And then who else can you work with? And if you're in a leadership position, you might have people on your team. You might actually have colleagues that are lateral colleagues that can kind of come to help out. Yeah. And then in some situations, it might just be time to think about a new role. And it's a good time to be doing that right now because things are changing a lot, and organizations are more open to lateral changes, I'm finding, than they ever were before. Yeah. So
I'm curious, as we talked a little bit, just obviously these would lead to different leadership styles. So does it work on it's a circle with the colors, right? I'm just curious, if someone is the opposite of you, does it tend to be that opposite color in that sense? So if I was, say I'm a high red, and I
Relational.
have someone reporting up to me that's off the chart blue. I assume this tool can be very helpful in just knowing how to have those conversations, right? And how to approach folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, it's about realizing that the person is not doing what they're doing just to drive you crazy, which is the way it can feel sometimes, right?
Sure.
So,
Most of
it's
them
really
are.
like
You should say most
of
people.
them are. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are. And so, first and foremost, it's just kind of saying, okay, where are their superpowers that I don't have, and how can I best partner with this other person so that I can bring to bear my best thinking and their best thinking? And most complex problems today require more than one approach, right?
Yeah.
So to be really effective in tackling problems, having more cognitive diversity is what we like to call at the table. So different kinds of thinkers to bring to the table is really a huge asset. But it can be challenging, especially if you are leading someone who just doesn't seem to get it. And so what I often say is, many of us have traveled to foreign countries where we don't speak the same language. And then maybe we try to figure out some basics so that we can adapt to that culture. Try to step into their shoes and have some empathy for their perspective, and look for ways to connect with them in a language that they're probably going to resonate with more than you think they might. And it's one of those things that seems so obvious, but don't treat them like you prefer to be treated. Treat them like they need to hear, so that they can best buy in. And it's kind of the opposite of the golden rule in some ways, but it really does make a difference. And they can be huge assets.
Yeah. But what strikes me is, I don't know if this is true, but I feel like most people, just out of sheer sort of survival, we tend to have plenty of empathy for our boss in the sense of like, we want to learn how they think and what do they value and how do I do well with them. But the best leaders also have the same thing for those. The best ones just have it intuitively to learn how those that follow them are also thinking. And maybe kind of an old school leadership style would be, just I'm the boss, just listen, figure me out. But as you're saying, the best leaders have a way of really caring about how to communicate. I love the analogy of the foreign language. How do I know to go to the bathroom and how to order tacos? Well, let's just start with that, right?
Right. Let's just start with that. Don't try to become somebody you're not.
Right.
Because that authenticity is so important. And at the same time, what you will notice when you're traveling to foreign countries is if you make any effort at all to communicate, people are incredibly appreciative and surprised, right? And that's going to be true here as well. It's like, oh, you paid attention to the fact that I speak in spreadsheets. So okay, I know that that's not your thing. But providing me with some data is really going to help me make this decision, right? So it's that notion of just being attentive, and sort of paying, and leaders often are the ones doing the least amount of talking, and maybe asking some really great questions. Right. And so one of my favorite tools for leaders is to have them do something called a whole brain walk around, which is really easy, using 4 critical questions. And it's something that if they do this pretty well, they'll figure out not only how those that they work with prefer to think, but also help them grow. And that is, whenever you know that somebody's going to come and try to pitch you an idea as a leader, you have them come prepared, answering 4 questions. What is the problem? So that's that analytical blue. What is the problem in a succinct way? Why, in that that experimental quadrant? Why is it important? Like, why should we be talking about this now? Who is most impacted in that relational quadrant, and what should we be looking to understand there? And then how do you recommend we proceed? So you're hitting all 4 quadrants. And if people come in having done that, and I worked with a leader some years ago he was great. He worked at Perfetti Van Mel. They're the Mentos people. And he said he got very, very clear with his team. And if they hadn't done that homework, he would send them back out and say, come back once you've answered those questions. And he said, suddenly the conversation, the richness, the breadth of the conversation, and that ability to solve the problem was the monkey was off of his back, and he was beginning to see other people bring solutions to the table, and also see their breadth of thinking and see where they were struggling. So if they struggled with the why question again and again, or if maybe the who question that got overlooked, they began to see where there might have been some gaps.
Yeah.
So it's a really simple way to apply whole brain thinking every day. Whenever you've got something that you're trying to really, crack as a tough problem, what is the real problem? Why is it important? Who's going to be most impacted? And then how do we think we can take 1 or 2 or 3 steps to start moving in the right direction? Super simple, low-hanging fruit. Anybody can do it.
Super simple, but very. Thank you for saying that, because I think that's a clear takeaway that I can start doing in my next meeting. You can start doing right now, right? Like,
right, absolutely.
It's right there for you. Could you talk a little bit about how our brain changes when we get in high stress situations? Because I know part of your assessment shows a little difference when people are maybe stressed out.
Absolutely. And I noted that in your assessment, your preferences change. Because I was able to take a look at it as we were talking earlier.
You have secret information? Wow. Okay.
So, so what we find is, and actually the pandemic was a very interesting example where we actually saw people saying that they were living in their under stress, under pressure profile. So what our assessment does is it looks at your sort of day-to-day default kind of way of thinking. And then if there is a shift under pressure, if your thinking shifts. And so, for you, when I looked at your data, you go much more analytical and sort of, let's just solve the problem. I just want to solve the problem. You might be more of a, hey, let's figure out what all the options are. And the day-to-day, you may shift to more like, we're just going to knock out a solution here. Sure. And just just get very, very focused. And less of that sort of detail-oriented kind of green, which is part of that practical self. And what's really helpful for people, as I mentioned earlier, during the pandemic, we saw that people said they were living in their under pressure profile because so much in their world had changed that they felt like they were under pressure every day because there was so much uncertainty. And it was tiring. And it was exhausting. And their family members saw a shift in behavior. Colleagues saw shifts in behavior because it seemed like everybody was kind of on edge and maybe showing up just a little bit differently. So what's really helpful is that shift can be a good shift. It can mean that actually your thinking is broadened, right? More than it might be in your day-to-day. Right. So how can you leverage that kind of thinking when you're under pressure? And then also recognize that you might have a blind spot that may actually increase because it sort of disappears under pressure. Yeah. And so, how do you make sure to mitigate against that? And then some people's profiles don't shift at all, which is fascinating. And what that means is, and you probably know some people like this, what that means is that you don't see a huge change. And you might know from the context that they're under pressure, but you're not seeing that. And for those leaders out there where you show up every day, kind of the way you, whether the world's falling apart around you or not, recognize that the people you work with may not know that you are feeling that pressure. Yeah. And you might want them to know so that they can understand, how they might help, right? So I had an assistant years ago who, because she knew me really well, under pressure, I go very blue, very, 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 very bottom line, very analytical. So she would check in with me at the beginning of our one-on-one and say, so Ann, how's it going today? Because she knew that if I was under pressure and feeling it, we were going to be having a very different conversation than the one that we might normally have. And I was just going to be wanting to knock out stuff and take care of business. So it was very, very helpful for us, in our day-to-day interaction to kind of understand that.
I just have a brain nerd question, but so my shrink tells me I get stuck in my reptilian brain. So that's like survival stuff, right? Is there a relation to that in this, that when we get stressed, we get a little more maybe lower on the Maslow pyramid or whatever, like a little more survival focused?
Some people actually do. When we look at the data, we find that there are a higher percentage of people who actually go very sort of emotional in that lower right red, which is kind of like they start to feel the emotions, or they go to that that very practical green, which is all about control and staying grounded and figuring out like, what do I do next? How do I take action? Like batten down the hatches, right? So we have found that for some people, but not everybody.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about this is, it's a very personal thing.
Yeah.
And so not everybody goes to that need for control or that sort of sense of, deep kind of an emotional reaction. Many of us will shift either to an area of very strong preference. We might go even further into that, or we might change and go to an adjacent quadrant. So it's an incredibly personal thing. And again, we're looking at preference here. So, that's really what we're measuring.
Could you, this has been fascinating. This is stuff I could talk about all day, but none of us got time for that, especially the listeners. But thank you so much for having this conversation. I want to make sure I ask, just tell us a little bit about how you practically help organizations and help people, and how people can, I'm sure people are hearing this and they want to know what they are. So how can people get involved and learn more?
Absolutely. So we're an organization that is really designed to help people make more than the sum of the parts, right? So whether it's their own brains, whether it's a team, whether it's an organization, how do I better understand how I think and how others think so that we can actually be happier, more productive, get more done. And that's really what we do as an organization. We work all over the world. And it's not just the assessment, even though we spend a lot of time talking about it. What's really powerful is that you go beyond. Once you learn this language, like we've been using over the last few minutes together, you can then do something like I suggested, use the 4-quadrant questions to prompt something. You can drive an innovation process in a way that allows you to do that. So the real exciting part of this is in applying this in a whole brain way in organizations, both from a leadership perspective, how you team and scale teaming across your organization is a huge focus right now. We just built an app inside of Microsoft Teams that allows you to see your data and then like build your agenda and know what to do and how to speak around those. So people can find us at thinkherrmann.com, which is Herrmann, the complexity of my last name there. And we have lots of tools there. We have a mini team assessment. And then I'll certainly be happy to provide some links that you can provide as well on your page for people to learn more about themselves and how they might take next steps.
Love it. 2 final questions, kind of off the wall. I'm an improv person. Second City Improv was my background. Improv became my life philosophy, very much yes and all this. I'm just curious, any studies you've done around improvisation or any thoughts on that as it relates to what we're talking about?
Not surprised based on your profile that would be something that you would love. I believe that improv is a critical skill for people in today's changing world. It's one of those things that even if it's something that you think never in a million years could I do that. Yeah. If you just learn enough about improv, you can begin to stretch that experimental part of your thinking and get more comfortable with it. And that's kind of the lay of the land in today's environment with all the change and uncertainty happening right at this very moment. So if that's something that you struggle with, improv is an absolutely fantastic strategy because it's going to pull that yellow out and allow you to play around. Yeah. And so I recommend to people, when they're feeling that moment of like, oh my God, there's so much going on. What do I do? Just stop and think. Take a moment to look at like what's going on. Give your brain a chance to breathe a little bit. Put that on your calendar every morning. And if maybe doing some improv will help you out, that might be a strategy. Maybe it's going back and learning something that's got technology related to it. Yeah. Maybe it's becoming part of a peer group that can help. Maybe it's part of, getting into some new processes that'll help you out. So take that moment to just stop and think. And I think you'll see that, that'll really make a difference. Your brain needs it.
Love it. Last question. I've been to France. I've never been to Paris somehow. I got to get there.
Wow.
So I know. What's the first thing I do when I get to Paris that only you know about? What's the secret place? Give us some insider information as a former resident.
Okay. Well, my favorite place to go, and I go almost every time I go, is the Rodin Museum. It's Rodin, the thinker. Now, I know that sounds kind of corny that I'm doing something thinking it would be the thinker.
Okay.
But it's not at all for that reason because I discovered it, before that. And it is an absolutely wonderful space because it's in his house. You could step into the shoes of an artist, and has the most amazing garden, sculpture garden in the back. And it was the place I would go to think. And it's just so it's one of my favorite spots. It's certainly not a secret, but it's one of my favorite spots. And so if you're looking for, you don't want to take the Louvre on and have to spend 3 days looking at art, you can knock this out in an afternoon and really enjoy it.
There you go, straight from the chief thought officer. I love it. And you're such a warm person, and it's been such an honor to get to talk to you. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you. What great questions. I really enjoyed it.
Good.